Hello everyone and welcome. This tutorial is going to focus on a couple additional techniques for polygon modeling that didn't fit into the X-Wing tutorial, which was already an epic series of tutorials. But this is going to focus on how to join two polygon meshes together. So in this tutorial, we're going to make a cup, right? Like a coffee mug with a handle, right? And so we're going to lay the cup shape and then use a sweep to make a handle, make those both editable, join those together as a singular mesh. It's a really useful tool and technique for plenty of different objects. And so we're going to learn how to do that. And then the other part of that is we're also going to be introduced to the subdivision surface, which basically rounds and softens geometry, and you can do all sorts of interesting things with it. There's a great tool called the subdivision weight tool that allows you to have certain areas have more rounding or less rounding. So let's get started by making our cup. And we're going to do this. It's going to be simple, quick, and hopefully pretty painless. All right, so to start with, we're going to go into our front view. And we want to make a cup that we're going to lathe around this center axis, right, the y-axis. So I'm going to go to my splines. And I'm going to go ahead and not use any of those. I don't even know what I'm doing. It's early in the morning. I'm going to go into points mode up at the top of the screen so I can be in points modeling mode. Then I'm going to grab my spline pen and I'm just going to make a very rectilinear cup. So I'm just going to click once close to the origin. And actually, there's one other additional technique we're going to cover right now. I want to introduce snapping. So we haven't talked about snapping, but snapping allows you to snap things to different either objects or the grid or points. It's really pretty fantastic. So if I click on this U icon up here, right at the top in the center, right? That's actually a magnet, although it looks like a U at a distance. This is my snapping tool. If I click on here, it says enable snap, enable quantizing. We'll talk about quantizing in a second. And then this is our settings for this. And so under snap, right, we can either make it tool specific, auto snap. There's all these different options. We can do points, edges, polygons, splines, intersections, etc. Grid or work plane, guides, right? There's all sorts of different settings we've got and ways we can snap. We can also do mesh checking through here, which is pretty great. I don't know why it's included here, but you know, it is. We'll go ahead and look at that tool as well, but not today. That'll be for a different tutorial. So quantize, right? So we can actually quantize it so we can only move it a certain number of centimeters at a time or a certain scale at a certain percent, and we can adjust how much that is. At this point, I don't really want to quantize, but what I do want to do is I do want to come down here to this grid work plane and I want to check mark that because I want this, I want my points to be snapped on the center and along the grids. So I've check marked grid work plane. I'm going to zoom this out again and close that. So if I hit escape, right, you'll see as I drag my point around, I can kind of click right somewhere in here and drop a point. I'm going to undo that. But if I slide along the edges of these grid points, it will snap to these corners. So I'm going to go ahead and snap one there. And I'm going to come out, let's just say 4 grid points, click again, go up about, let's just do this many. Actually, no, we'll do this much because it's a mug, so it's reasonably short. Now, I am going to go about halfway with this one, and I'm going to click so I can make the wall of my cup. And I'm going to go about halfway here as well. These I'm not too concerned about. My biggest concern are that these 2 points right here snap to the grid. If I hold down shift, no, it's not going to let me do it. It's fine. But I don't even care if this is like a thing. And then I just need to go and finish my spline. I'm going to click that. I'm going to hit escape. and I'm going to go ahead and use my move tool or selection tool. I'm going to select my spline. Now let's see which one of these is the one. There we go. I accidentally created another one earlier. I'm going to delete that. Okay, I've got my spline. Now, if I use my brush selection tool, I can select this point, and if I want to double check and make sure it's actually zeroed on the y-axis, remember when you're lathing something, if these center points are not straight on the axis, if they're offset this way or this way, you'll either get a gap if they're on this side, and if they're extended beyond on this side a little bit, you'll get intersecting geometry, which if you get that, the way Cinema 4D draws it now, at least on the Mac, is it ends up being it looks like a black hole, like it's just black on there, and that's like a very clear visual indication that you have your geometry is essentially intersecting, because you're rotating this around and you're just putting it on top. So if I select that point and I come down here to this little axis thing down here, that's the coordinate manager, I can pop that open and I can say it's got a Y position, but the X and the Z are 0. That's what I want. I could also select this one, right? And this one you can see X is off a little bit, right? It's a little bit below 0, it looks like. And so, or it's actually a little bit to the right. You can see if I zoom way in, I missed. So I could either, right, I have snapping enabled. I could either just come up here and just snap that into place like so. And now it's all at 0. Or I could have manually gone in and entered these values to set it to 0. So I did make a mistake on that first one. So even with quantize, right, or not quantize, but even with everything set, I can still have points that are not quite on the grid. It's snapped to like a smaller grid point, if that makes sense. Because you can see this is sort of infinity of grids, right? It just keeps going and going and going. So we just want to make sure that these points are fine. Everything else doesn't really matter. Okay, so I've got this. So let's go ahead and create our loft. So I'm going to click here. I'm going to, not loft, sorry, our lathe. I'm going to make a lathe. And remember, it's a generator, so this needs to be a child of that. And if I come back to my 3/4 view, I now have this beautiful cup. It looks like it's a little bit short, so maybe I need to extend it a touch. So if I uncheck my lathe object so I can see my spline again, I could come into one of these side views, select the 2 points up here, right, using my brush selection tool, and I can just drag this up. And I'm just going to do 2 more because I want plenty of space for this handle. Okay, so let's go back and take a look at our scene and turn our lathe back on. Great, that looks like a much more muggy mug. So now we're going to create our handle, and we're going to do that right using a spline and using the sweep. So I'm going to go, and then we'll need a spline for the cross section as well. So to start with, I'm going to start by making the shape of the handle. Now, I could do the right side. I'm going to go ahead and keep it on the front side of this. I'm going to deselect everything. If I start, there's a chance that if I use my spline pen while I have this spline selected, it's going to add it into that spline, and that's not what we want. That would create some really crazy things. So we're not going to do that. So I could use a spline pen, or I could use Sketch. And for me, I'm going to use Sketch, and I kind of want this to hook up and and dip down. So I'm going to go ahead and, yeah, so Snap doesn't work so great when you're using the Sketch tool. So I'm going to turn snapping off. And again, I can click here. You can also hold down Shift S to disable or enable snapping. And so I'm going to disable snapping. And I'm going to go ahead and do a little kind of sloppy handle. Now, in our case, because we want to join these two things together, I'm not going to have this terminate some mug handles will sweep against this and curl back or something like that. We're not going to do that in this case, just to make our lives easier for this tutorial. It just makes the next steps a little bit easier. So we're going to go ahead and, because I freehanded this, I'm going to use Spline Smooth. And I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to start clicking and trying to smooth this handle out a little bit. Oops, that was a little bit much. And just try and really clean this up a little bit more. This is a really terrible looking handle. And maybe I need to actually just pull this in a touch, but I'm just going to keep smoothing until I'm happy. The thing that you should definitely always do some smoothing on is the end, right? Because especially freehand, if I kind of twist a little bit at the end, it's going to have a pretty hard turn and a bunch of points there, and that's going to be problematic. So, right, so we know we're joining this. We want this to be like a smooth transition. And I'm just going to keep going, and if there's, a few extra points, I'm going to try and get as many of those points out as possible. Sometimes it adds more points in. I'm going to undo that last... No, I'm going to redo that last smoothing, and I'm just going to come down here, and I'm just clicking and dragging to do that curve this time, and click and drag to do a curve here this time, clean that up a little bit. Okay, so it's a little bit, right, this is kind of a goofy handle, but it's fine. It's going to do what we need to do. I'm not going to spend any more time on it. Okay, so I am going to maybe just change the spline name to handle so I know which one I'm selecting. And then I'm going to need to create something to do a cross section. I'm going to go ahead and do a circle cross section. And we're going to make some pretty major changes to how that looks, because we're going to start with like really the fewer polygons, the better, right? But so if I go to my circle, it's obviously too big. So I'm going to go ahead and make this, we'll say 30 centimeters, maybe somewhere around there. For now, it should work. And then I need to create my sweep. So I'm going to go to the subdivision surface. I'm going to come over here, sweep, and I want to grab those two splines and make them children of the sweep. And if I have the circle should be the top, the handle should be the second child. And then if I go to a different view, it looks like, the default orientation, sorry, I'm going to hit H on here. The default orientation of the circle and the spline that I drew worked out, right? Again, if for some reason yours looks flatted in one direction or another, just switch the plane of the circle until it has some dimension to it. Okay, so now I've got this. Let's go ahead and turn on garage shading lines in our display. So we're going to say display, garage shading lines. And you can see that I've got a boatload of geometry here and very little geometry here. If I want to try and join these together, this is going to be, with the tools I'm going to show you, this is going to be really problematic because one, that's a lot of geometry. I don't want to have to deal with trying to connect and deal with all of these points. And it's incongruent in the sense that, if I try and join this, I'm going to have to delete this entire thing or two of these facets, and really I need a smaller amount of geometry in this part. So how do I fix these problems? Well, first, let's go to our sweep, and the sweep doesn't really have any details we can change here to reduce the amount of geometry on this. What we need to do is we need to be selecting the circle or the handle, right? The circle is going to control these rotational segments. The handle is going to control, the segments along that are slicing it in this direction. And so if I go to my circle, you'll see the intermediate points are set to uniform and the number is 8. If I want this to be the simplest form of circle possible, I can just say none. And what that does is it creates a square, right? There is nothing else going on there. And actually, this is exactly what I want. It's the fewest number of polygons possible, which is exactly what we want. We're going to be, and you're like, well, this is going to be super sharp and edged, but that's what we're going to be using the subdivision surface to accommodate once we do the rest of the work on this model. So we've got this set. Let's go to our our handle spline. And now, we've got our intermediate points set to adaptive. What we should probably do here is set this to uniform. And you can see that right now that means there's an intense amount of geometry there. And let's just reduce this number until we get to a point where, I mean, even 0 is probably great for this, right? We're going with like the lowest poly stuff we can to start with. And so I've got this set to 0. Again, right, the fewer polygons, the happier we are with our geometry. So now what we need to do is we need to create some more subdivisions in this direction and reduce the number of subdivisions on around the rotation of the cup. So we're going to go ahead and select our lathe, and the lathe, that's where some of our subdivisions are, right? So our rotational subdivisions are available through the lathe. So if I pull this up, and what I'd really like is basically to have the number of subdivisions that's currently on there, because you can see that this handle fits nicely between 2 subdivisions. And so I'm going to go ahead and change this to 16, right? In the past, I've said that we should add more subdivisions to make things rounder. And again, right, the subdivision surface is going to do that for us. Now, the other issue here is I need to add, right, more vertical subdivisions. So if I select my spline, you'll see that it's currently set to Bezier. The intermediate points are adaptive. Because these are all hard corners, that means there are, like, and I did hard interpolation, that means there are no intermediary points, right? It's just exactly what I put, you know, the points I put down are the only points there are, and those are the polygons that we've got. So I'm going to change this adaptive to uniform. And when I do that, what that's going to do is it's going to, right, uniformly subdivide everything. And so it looks like I probably need to reduce this some as well. Right, so I'm going to just keep going until I get to a place where ideally, there we go, right? One of these subdivisions, and you know, I might want to make this a little bit, there we go. I think that's probably actually going to be better. And then I'm also probably going to reduce the scale of my handle a touch. The whole goal here is because of the way this is set up, and I want you to note that with the uniform subdivisions, you can see what's happening to the edge of the cup already, right? Because these are uniform, it actually ignores the point position, and it tries to make everything fit. You can test these different options. I can go to natural, and you'll see that natural allows me to have bigger subdivisions on the sides, but then it fills in some subdivisions on this top surface. This is actually probably the mode that I want to be in. If I go to subdivided, that adds, basically it uses angles and maximum length as the qualities there. And so you can kind of see that, right, it gets a lot denser closer to the edges. And then there's this maximum distance. If I change my maximum length to 20, right, I'm going to have significantly larger ones. This might be useful too. What's interesting is there's a lot of different ways we can work. And each one has like reasons why you'd want to do that. But I think if we go with natural, we're going to have the easiest time with this model. We have the fewest number of polygons, but we do actually have a fair amount of polygons on the top surface here. And so I know from experience that that's going to help us later. So I'm going to go ahead and scale this down with the goal of having this polygon more or less align with, right, this next step down. So let's go to our side view, or our front view, excuse me. And we are going to grab our spline, and rather than doing the whole lathe, I'm just going to be scaling the spline. And to do that, I'm going to need to go to model mode. I'm going to need to uncheck the lathe. Oops, sorry, I'm selecting the entirely wrong thing. I'm going to select the handle in model mode, uncheck the sweep. Now I've got this spline that I can see and manipulate. I'm going to hit the letter T on the keyboard, and I'm going to go ahead and scale this down. And you'll see it's going to move into the cup a bit. If I scale this down some and I hit the letter E, I'm going to just pull this over a touch. So we want a gap right now. And then I'm going to turn my sweep back on and make sure that looks pretty good. You'll see this bottom part of the handle now, right, is a little low still. So maybe I need to scale it just a touch more. So I'm going to hit the letter T again. And I should be able to scale this now that I have it selected. Yeah, I'm going to scale it down just a touch more. And now I can lift it up a little bit so that it, fits more closely to where the handle should be. And again, I'm going to pull this out so there's a noticeable gap. And that's just because it's going to make it easier for me to do the next steps when we start modeling this. Okay, so let's pop back to our view here. Go back to our perspective view. And this is the basic setup we need. The only issue is, right, that this is aligned with one edge here, and we want it aligned in with the polygon. So I'm going to grab my sweep. I'm going to use the rotate tool, and I might go to my top view to make this easier to see, and pop over here. And I'm going to go ahead and rotate this a few degrees. Oops, I have the wrong thing selected. I guess I could rotate the handle. It doesn't really matter, but I'm going to rotate the cup, and I'm going to rotate this just a handful of degrees until it's, close to parallel with this edge here. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it just needs to be reasonably close. Okay, so now that we've done this, we've got our cup. Now we need to start making these editable and be able to make changes here. And you'll see that bottom one actually fits pretty well in that polygon down there too. Great. So before we make any changes, what I suggest you do is that we close up both of these objects so they're collapsed. We create a null object. We select both the sweep and the lathe, make them children of the null, and then we rename the null to, we'll call it cup backup. Or we'll just call it cup. Let's just call it cup because we're going to be using it not just as a backup. So I've got this set as cup. It's just one group right now. It's not a single object. It's just a group. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hold down Control, click and drag to copy and paste that. And then I am going to hide. I'm going to turn the dots red, if you can see that on your screen, for the top one, because this is my backup. What this does is basically ensures that if I make some terrible mistake when I'm working on this, on my cup and joining it, that I have something to go back to, right? It's kind of akin to saving the file or saving like a version of the file. But this way I've got it there. And if I've failed myself in a horrible way, I have something to go back to. And I have not saved this file yet, so I'm going to go ahead and save it now as well. I'm just going to call it cup toot, which should be great. And I'm going to hit save. Okay. So let's go ahead and uncollapse this. And we need to make these things editable. There's a couple other things we need to change on this sweep. I want you to note that the sweep currently has caps on the end. So I'm going to select my sweep object. I'm going to go to caps and I'm going to uncheck start and end, right? Because this is going to be a skin that gets attached to this other object. All right, so I've got that set. Yay. And there's nothing else I need to do to the lathe. So if I right click on my sweep, there's a couple different things I can do here, and we haven't really talked about these. First, I can make this editable or try current state to object. And it depends on what you're doing, and sometimes the outcome is more or less useful. So let's start with current state to object. If I select the sweep and I do current state to object, what you'll see is that now I have this object that is a polygon object, and it's basically made a copy of the existing sweep. So let's see what happens if I select this sweep and I say make editable. Right? In this case, I get the same result. Now, there are times when one of these or the other will create a hierarchy of objects instead of just creating a singular polygon object. And it really depends on what the object is. Sometimes you just got to test both of them and see. I don't know the logic as to why one does one thing and one does the other thing for different sets of geometry. But In this case, they both work the same. So I'm just going to undo that last step. And because I know that I've already got this one saved, I'm just going to go ahead and delete that and leave my polygon copy. So now I'm going to go to my lathe. I'm going to right click. I'm going to go down to, let's say, current state to object as well. Does the same thing, creates this lathed object. Fantastic. Now I can delete this. Okay, so I've got these two polygon objects and I need to join these together, right? And then because what I want to do is I want to basically delete this polygon, and use the polygon pen tool to join these meshes together. But if they're two separate meshes, I can still, I could still take the polygon pen tool if I select the sweep and go to points mode. I'm not even going to delete that, but I can still, using the polygon pen tool, right? Oops, not move the point. I can click on the point, right? And I can actually come over here, and if I had snapping enabled right now, it would actually snap to this other mesh and it would look as though they were connected. And they wouldn't be. So what I need to do is I need to hold down Shift and select both of these meshes, right click, and I need to go down to Connect Objects and Delete. And what that does is basically it's going to connect these into one mesh and delete the two objects that I started with. Now, sometimes you just want to connect objects and have your copy there so you can go back and fix things if needed. In this case, I'm just going to go like that. And now we have this one object. Whatever the top object is going to be the name that gets transferred over. So this is our sweep. We could rename this to cup now. And let's go ahead and start working on our cup. So I'm going to select the cup. I'm going to use my brush selection tool, and I'm going to go to polygon mode to start. And I'm just going to select this polygon, and you could either hit delete now, or you could hold down Shift, select this other polygon down here that's the one that's most well aligned with that bottom edge, and hit delete, right? So now I have two holes in the mesh. And because I took the caps off here, I have additional holes there. So now what I need to do is I need to join this edge, right, to this edge. And there's a couple ways I can do this. We'll go ahead and let's look at using, there's this tool called Stitch and Sew that we're going to attempt to use first. So I'm going to go to points mode, and I'm going to use my loop selection tool. Right, so I'm going to hit either U and then L on the keyboard, or I can click over here. And I want to loop select this hole. And I want to hold down Shift and loop select, right, that edge there. Now there's a bunch of tools over here, right, that we've used some of them. We've used weld before. What weld does is if we were to try and use weld right now, if I select this, what it does is it will take all of the points you've selected and weld them into a single point, which is kind of nice, but it's not exactly what we want to have happen here. The alternative to that is Stitch and Sew. So what Stitch and Sew does is, and I'm going to see if it'll work. It may not work this time, but we'll see. Oh, yes, it does. Okay. So, oops, I'm going to undo that. So what Stitch and Sew does is it will take, and they have to be the same number of points. You need 4 points here and 4 points here, or 5 points or 6 points or whatever it is. But you need that many number of points to be even on both sides, or else strange things begin to happen. But basically what it does is it says, oh, if you take this point and drag it to here, then it's going to go clockwise around and connect the rest of the points. And I can't remember if you can, no, there's no option here. I was going to say, I couldn't remember if you could tell it to go clockwise or counterclockwise, but you cannot. So, right, this is up in the center point. I'm just going to go ahead and see what happens if I drag this over here and connect it like this, right? So now we've got something of a twist in our geometry, right? Because this handle wasn't exactly where we wanted it to be. Something I could have done when this was still an editable, or was still a sweep, is I could have rotated all of these points at that point. But instead I didn't. So what I might do is just relax this a little bit by using my loop selection tool and hitting R and just and making sure I'm in this mode, and I want you to note some of the things that are probably going to go wrong with this, but I'm just doing like a slight release on this. UL, select this one, R, but you'll see it, right? I'm just going to do it a little bit. Maybe there's some flourish on this handle. If we go back to our cup, if I hide this one real quick and I turn this one on and we go in here, I want to show you the setting that would resolve this, but I'm not going to go back and do it because we're just going to go with what we've got and see what it looks like when it's done. So if I go to the Object tab, one of the settings here is end rotation. And so, right, I can actually rotate this around, right? I could get this to align, this handle to align down here with this polygon that way, but this one isn't aligned, right? It's just doing that one rotation. If I set this back to 0 and go down to this little details thing that is hard to see, right? We talked about scale before when we did tentacles, but this is the rotation, right? And so if I was to, right, so this allows me to rotate both sides, right? So I can rotate the starting end and I can rotate the actual end. And I just want those to be about the same, right? So that's a way that I could fix the problem that I've got now very, very quickly. And so if you want to use the more accurate model or the more aligned version, go for it. I'm going to just keep going strong with the mangled one, just for fun, because we'll see how it goes when we do the things we're going to do. Now, one of the other things I might do is I might want to, this is like a pretty big polygon gap here. And so knowing that it's going to be like a strange size for subdivisions, what I may do is I may go to edges mode, select my cup, use the loop selection tool, select this, and then use the slide tool to just slide this down a little bit to make this transition a little more smooth. And I could probably loop select this and then use the slide tool again. And I can't remember if slide is MS. No, it is M something else, which is always useful. I can't even see it on there. So, it's O, M-O. Great. And I might just go ahead and pull a couple of those there to even that spacing out. And I'm going to go ahead and now I'm going to do the end here. So I'm going to go to points mode. I'm going to hit U and L to do loop selection. I'm going to select this, hold down Shift, select those points, come over to here where the stitch and sew icon is now on top because it's the last tool I used, right? That's where weld is usually, but right, so it's there. And I'm going to do the same thing, just come over here, click this. And in this case, right, that twist isn't so bad, but maybe I'll go ahead and go to edges mode and say UL and select this ring. I might rotate it a little bit anyway, just a little bit of a twist there. And then I'm going to hit M and O to do the slide and drag this over a touch. And then U and L to loop select this, MO to slide this a little bit more, right? And then I get like a much smoother transition between those polygon surfaces. Okay, and now I have this like hilariously shaped mug with a kind of insane handle attached to the side of it. So we're at a good point. Let's go ahead and save our work, this beautiful, beautiful mug I've made. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create a subdivision surface. And so I'm going to add my subdivision surface. And then what I want to do is I want to make my cup a child of the subdivision surface. And I don't need this group anymore. So I'm just going to grab the cup object, make it a child of the subdivision surface, and then I'm going to delete that empty null object. Okay, and so now you can see the power of a subdivision surface, right? It has smoothed all of this geometry, and it's made, right? It's made everything nice and uniform and clean and smooth. And part of the reason it's working as honestly as well as it is just in default is the way that this object works. And so what I want to show you is how it functions by working with a slightly different object. And then we can come back and you could experiment with, making changes and weighting things and things like that as we go forward. So note that if I select my cup, you can see the original geometry, right? And then you can see what the subdivision surface has done to it. And so let's go ahead and save this. I'm going to go ahead and create a new file so I can show you with a very simple object what subdivision surface does and how it functions. So I've got my cube, right? The simplest object. It has one segment per side, right? So if I create a subdivision surface and I make a cube a child of the subdivision surface, I get kind of a chunky sphere, right? And what this is doing is what the subdivision surface does. I'm going to put display garage shading lines on here, right? And it is actually a sphere. It's a hexahedron shaped sphere. And so what this does is it basically tries to, take these points and average where they're at, right? So it's doing all of this smoothing. It's averaging all the polygons and reshaping that down to this. Now, if I increase the number of segments, so let's say in the X I have 2 segments, right? And I click on my cube so I can see that. Oh, I can't see the base geometry because it's a primitive, but that's fine. So, right, I've got 2, or if I do 3 or 4 or 5, you'll see, right, because these, and if I uncheck this, right, because these are more, right, there's more density of points here and more density of polygons here, right, when it goes to average them, these are going to essentially weight that average, right, because there's more of them on this surface, so it's not going to bend as much in that direction, right, where it's still going to be, right, in these 2 planes, it's going to be rounding significantly more. Right. And so then if I was to say, oh, well, let's try this, let's add some in the X, right? I can start to get, you can kind of see how this works and how eventually it basically gets to a point where I'd have like a rounded cornered cube, right? And the more I do, the tighter and tighter those things are going to get, right? So I have, all of these different, right, possible variations in there just by using this cube and setting different numbers of segments. I'm going to set this back down to 0 for each of these. I think that's what needs to be 0, tab, 0, tab, 0. All right, so we're back at the sphere shape. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this editable. Not the subdivision surface, though, just the cube. And with the cube selected in the subdivision surface, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my loop cut tool. So I'm going to I'll go to edges mode. And you can see this is the original cube and that's what it looks like now. So if I go ahead and use my loop cut tool, right, which I'm just going to click over here and grab this time, but loop cut is K and then L. What you can do is if you need something that's rounded, like in the past I've done actually a cylinder with 6 sides. You can make one of those like nuts that's got like the rounded cap on it, the safety cap. But depending on where I make a cut, I can have a lot of control over the shape of this object. So if I click up here and make a cut, I can use that to make this really interestingly shaped object very quickly, right? It's kind of organic in form, but it's just by doing one cut. So you can experiment with this and see how this goes. If I get really, really close to the existing corner, I'm going to get like a much harder edge that way, right? So this is another way that we can use subdivision surfaces as, and line cuts and things as a modeling tool to make, somewhat interesting forms quickly. You have to kind of get used to how it functions, and it's going to work differently on different objects. If I loop cut this, right? Again, I can continue to take this one cube, and based on where the subdivisions are, the subdivision surface is going to make changes. Now, one of the other things I can do is I can use something called the subdivision weight tool. And so if I select my subdivision if I select my cube, and there's this little lock icon with like the same subdivision-y, look there. If I select this, this is the weight subdivision surface tool. Now, I don't have any edges or anything selected. And so what I need to do is I need to select something in order for this to work. So I'm going to go ahead and use my brush selection tool. I'm in edges mode, and I'm going to go ahead and just select this edge over here. If I have that selected and I click on this weight tool, and then off in space I click and drag in one direction, what I can do is I can either say this is 100% weighted, right? The subdivision surface is having the most impact. And if I slide the other direction, this is having no impact on those edges, right? And so you can see that I can make these hard corners. So let's say I wanted this corner to actually be like a hard edge. I'm going to undo what I just did there. And I'm going to go ahead and use my brush selection tool. I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to select all three of these edges here. I'm going to leave that one not selected so we can kind of see what happens there. And if I'm in edges mode and I have this selected, I'm going to go ahead and use my weighted subdivision surface, and I can click, right? And it looks kind of silly because of the way it's working, right? But now I can have this like one hard corner, even though the subdivision surface is working the rest of the way, right? In the example I was mentioning earlier, where like say I have a cylinder, I'm going to hide my cube and all of this real quick. If I take this cylinder and I change the rotation segments to 6, right, I have like a hexagon. And if I make this a little bit shorter, let's just make it 50 tall. No, let's make it 100 tall. All right. And then I go ahead and apply a subdivision surface to this, which, there we go, subdivision surface, cylinder's a child, right? It's going to make this shape, which isn't something I'm necessarily interested in, right? And I'm going to set the height. If I set the height segments down to like, I'm going to leave it at 4 for now. And then if I go ahead and make this cylinder editable, now I can start to manipulate this. So I could use this weighted subdivision tool, and I can to make like hard edges and then something more round. And so I'm going to go ahead and hit U and L. And I've been doing all of this in edges mode. I'm going to show you what happens in points mode and polygons mode here in a second as well. But if I go ahead and say, okay, I want to select this and this, because this is where, like, say my bolt head's going to be. I'm going to then grab my weight subdivision surface, and I can click and drag and unweight that. And you'll see that it made it a cylinder with a hard edge there, but it didn't actually do the points, right? Because I didn't select these vertical edges. So I'm going to use a different tool that we haven't really talked about yet, which is similar to loop selection. It's ring selection. If I do ring selection, what that does is it's going to do like a ring of these edges, right? So I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to select both of those. I don't think I'm going to need to do this edge. We'll see in a second. If I have to, I'll go back and do it. So I'm going to click on this. And now if I pull this out, right, now I get this, right, this bolt head that is hard, has hard edges on one point, and then it softens up. Now, something I can use as well is if I do loop selection, if I want to change these, like this to be a harder transition point, what I can do is I can use my slide tool. So I can come over here, I can click on slide, and I can just slide this down, right, to adjust how this, how this edge is. I can get really close. I could also, right, then do other operations too. I could, if I rotate my view a touch, I could scale this right in a touch if I wanted to. Not out. There we go. Let's go in. I don't know why that's right. And so now I've got like a really strange shape, but right. So I can start to manipulate things that way as well. If I say UL again, and so I can loop select this edge. And if I was to use my slide tool on this, right, I can just slide this down. I could get more of a, more of a bell shape up top. And yeah, so you can see that this can be a pretty effective way to make somewhat complex models where you have hard edges and rounded geometry all put together. Sometimes you get crazy results, and I do want to show you what happens when you try and do this with points. So if I go into points mode, I'm just going to go ahead and hit UL so I can loop select the points on the top here that we haven't really manipulated yet. And I'm going to do my subdivision weight, click and drag, and right, it pulls those points out. Right, but it's going to leave, but where there are not points, it's going to leave things between. So this can be useful, like if I needed spikes. But a lot of times working with subdivision weighting in points mode is not the best. It does some really strange things. So let's look at polygon mode. So if I was to go into polygon mode and use my brush selection tool, let's go ahead and just select these two polys. And then we will use the weight tool here. If I pull this out, right, you can see that that is usually like an effective way too. I find that I tend to work more with edges and polygon weighting. But, if you need these like a flat surface like this or a hard edge, this is a way that you can do this. If I undo that and I just select, let's just select one. I just kind of want to see what this looks like. And then I'm going to go to my subdivision weight tool. There is quick key for this. It's MR. I don't ever remember that though. Right. But so this allows, right, that one plane to go back to where it was. Right. So this is right. These are some of the settings on the subdivision tool. So if I was to hop back over to my cup, right, I could use what I've just learned about subdivision weighting to make some of these edges harder. I could also be like, oh, well, actually, maybe I want the bottom of this cup, to be, really crisp. I could add a thing in here. If I wanted some faceting on the cup for some reason, or I wanted this to be like a strange cup, I could come over here to polygon mode and I could just select all the polys on this one face here. I could use my subdivision weight, right? And I can crank this out and I could potentially make a cup that would have, hard edges. Now you'll notice, right, what happened at the top here isn't exactly ideal. So I could undo that, and maybe I just want to select, right? If I hold down Control, I can deselect that one, and maybe I'll leave the bottom one there, right? And I can click and drag and pull this out, which I don't know why it's not going all the way out, but that's about as far as she wants to go. All right, so I can go ahead and I could, adjust geometry that way. If I wanted more freedom, if I wanted this to be more rounded to start with, I could have done just a different base. I could, when I did my lathe for this cup, I could have on my spline, right, instead of using natural, and I'm going to go ahead and turn this on real quick and turn this one off so we can just see this one, right? So I could have come over here and on the spline, I could have changed this from natural. I could have said, right, uniform, and set my number to like, 3 or something. And then if I was to apply a subdivision surface to that, which I'm going to do, but without the handle attached, I'll make this, there we go. And I'm going to make this a child of that. Right, so this allowed some more rounding. You can see that actually looks a lot more cup-like because of the way this lip is done. And it's also rounded the inside significantly. And then the base is also more round. But if I'm like, oh, I like how round that is up top, but I'd like to add more firmness down here. Then I would need to make this editable, and then I could use the subdivision surface I could make some cuts, add some additional geometry, and stiffen up and make those edges like a harder corner. Okay, so this is this tutorial. We made a cup, and yeah, it's pretty exciting cup to make. The next tutorial builds on this. We're gonna basically be lighting and using cameras on this cup, making this beautiful scene come to life. And we'll look at a couple examples, but I just want to show you how to use lights and cameras. And this will be our first introduction to Redshift, the render engine, which is the default renderer for Cinema 4D now.